Now we have enough background to begin discussing our main topic, which is the theory of observation in discrete space-time. We begin with a very simple and very general description of some basic ingredients that almost any conceivable theory of observation will incorporate. To begin with, we have an observer O of some sort, which we symbolize by the red box. Later, we'll clarify what assumption we are making about what constitutes an observer. Secondly, we have some object of observation, which we call the observed system S, and we symbolize this by the green box. Finally, we have the flow of information I between the observed system and the observer. We can note even at this early stage how the directed structure of discrete spacetime model we have been discussing fits naturally together with the basic picture of observation, since there is a natural directed relationship between the observed system S and the observer O. We find it convenient to use the mapping notation for the flow of information, but we are not assuming that this relationship is actually a morphism of some kind in a category theoretic sense. However, it plays essentially the same role as a morphism in some ways. Before going into details of observation in discrete spacetime, it is useful to preview the basic contrast between the observation in general relativity and the observation in discrete causal theory. In general relativity, an observer O and an observed system S inhabit localized region of spacetime manifold colored red and green in the picture, and the information flows from S to O along the causal curves through the yellow region. Notice that the contrast between the spacetime itself and the matter-energy content of the spacetime comes into play here. Remember that general relativity isn't perfectly background independent in a sense that it does not treat spacetime and matter-energy as emergent aspect of unified fundamental structure. So in general relativity, we have to distinguish between where O and S are and what they are. Practically speaking, this just means that observation isn't solely about geometry. Instead, O and S are material things that are embedded in the geometry. Now we look at the discrete causal picture. There are some obvious similarities. We still have a localized observer O and the observed system S. The information I flows from O to S along the chains, which are discrete causal analogs of causal curves. A potential difference, however, is that the local irregularities of discrete directed sets might allow us to model emergent matter and energy with the same type of basic directed structure that gives rise to emergent spacetime. In other words, we can potentially say that O and R are subobject of directed sets rather than just being located in such subobjects. When we begin to imagine the details of observation, we quickly encounter structural and philosophical complication. In elementary situations such as introductory special relativity, it suffices to think of an observer O as being located at a specific point in spacetime manifold associated with a particular frame of reference or coordinate system. Any other point in spacetime will either be in past of O or future of O or causally unrelated to O. However, we know that real observation involves extended reason in both spatial and temporal sense. This fact has important theoretical consequences. For example, observation requires information transfer and therefore involves entropy consideration. This leads to the idea of storing information in fundamental spacetime architecture, which necessarily requires subobject more complicated than individual points. When one begins to deal with the extended object, the possible type of relationship becomes more complicated than the trichotomy of past, future, and unrelated. In particular, such object may overlap. The observed system may include the path of the observer. The notion is quite common in an informal sense, as the scientists observe themselves carrying out an experiment. However, in a formal level, it can raise questions of self-reference and even produce structural analogies of closed causal curves. For simplicity, we will mostly ignore the theory of self-observation, but the notion is worth mentioning. Another basic complication is the contrast between classical and quantum observation. As described in the previous slide, quantum observation involves multiple discrete spacetime. This leads to the several possible options of how to generalize the observer O and the observed system S that we encounter in the classical theory. Later, we will introduce some of these options. We mostly avoid basic philosophical issues with the theory of observation, but we mention a few of such issues in order to acknowledge their existence. First, a common question associated with the interpretation of quantum theory is whether or not the presence of the observer is necessary to determine or actualize certain properties of the observed system. At the furthest extreme, it has been suggested that the universe owes its existence to the observer. We do not make such assumptions, nor do we assume that all the possible observation of a system necessarily characterize that system in its entirety. We allow possibility of structural features that are not even completely accessible to observation, even in theory. Finally, we harbor no mystical or anthropomorphic ambitions, such as attempting to describe or explain the notion of consciousness or free will in an observational setting. Now we have enough background to begin making some formal definitions. An observation in a directed set D consists of a triple SIO of subobject D, where the letter stands for system, information flow, and the observer. For simplicity, we will usually work with full subobject, but this choice could be relaxed. The most basic requirement for O to observe S is that some information from S reaches O. And when we translate this into technical terms, it means that O intersects a future of S in a non-trivial way. The simplest way to describe I is to say that it is a family of chain from S to O. Of course, some of the chains might overlap and lead to overcounting, so perhaps we could be more precise and say I is a subobject of a subobject whose elements and relations belong to a chain from S to O. But the basic meaning is obvious. It is worth a while to repeat that we are working classically at the moment because only one directed set is involved. Hence, this is a classical observation. Also, we are being ambitious by assuming that the subobject O and S can define what an observer and the observed system are rather than just merely where they are. We would have to modify our viewpoint for the models like spin form, which include auxiliary structure. In that case, we would have to add a description of such structure to our definition of S, I, and O. Our present definition includes only what must be included for all the discrete spacetime model involving underlying directed sets. Hence, we know that all the theory we develop will be relevant even if it turns out to be incomplete. Obviously, some observations are better than the others, in a sense that they detect more information about the observed system. An ideal observation samples all the information, or at least all the information that remains intact after propagation to the observer. It is easy to understand the notion of ideal observer in a visual sense. Here we show the observed system S in green and we follow every ascending chain from S to see where it terminates. In this particular diagram, all such chains eventually reach the observer O. This is what it means O to sample all the data flowing from S. In the right-hand diagram, however, there exists chains beginning at S which do not intersect at O. These chains which are shown in black carry information to the future which are not sampled by O. There's a helpful relativistic analogy here which actually extends somewhat more general setting in the study of partial differential equations. A relativistic spacetime manifold is called globally hyperbolic if it contains a spatial section called a Cauchy surface, which intercepts all the information flowing from its past to its future. The existence of Cauchy surface enables a solution of an initial value problem in which one may solve for the values of certain information throughout the spacetime given information of these values on the surface. An ideal observer plays a similar role. Structurally, such an observer contains a complete impermeable section of future of S which intercepts all the information flow. We return to the idea on the next slide after making a couple of remarks. First, the very general setting we are presently discussing, there is no reason to assume that even so-called empty spacetime will preserve information flowing from past to future. The most extreme example of possible information loss would be something like a big crunch, where all the chains flowing from S are forced through a bottleneck. Second, even if O samples all available information flowing from S, there is no guarantee that O will store such information. For example, Cauchy's surface in relativity has no temporal thickness and so stores nothing. The issue of information storage is closely related to entropy of O, which we will discuss in a later slide. If we want to make an ideal observation, then we need to have an ideal observer. In some ways, it makes more sense to focus on the properties of the observer in this context rather than the properties of the observed system. The reason why is that the observed system is something we typically can control or maybe even don't want to control because that would defeat the purpose of discovering how it behaves naturally, which is the whole point of the observation. So we imagine that the observed system is just some kind of God-given structure and we think about how we could arrange the observer to capture the data of that structure. From the previous slide, we know that we should look at the future of the observed system and somehow arrange that the observer contains an appropriate section of that future, analogous to Cauchy surface, which will intercept all the information flowing to the future. For the definition of an ideal observer, we simply insist that O should have this property. But when we begin to examine what type of structure suffice to define such an observer, we run into a problem called permeability, which has been discussed in some causal set literature. In the left-hand diagram here, we reproduce a non-ideal observer O from the previous slide. We already noted how some information from S escapes O on its way to the future. At an intuitive visual level, it looks like we have two problems here. First, the observer isn't wide enough to cut through the entire future of S. Second, O has some holes in it which lets the information leak through. Structurally, we can lump these two problems together and just say that O is permeable. Information can get through it or around it without intersecting it. So, what property would O have to have in order to prevent this? It might seem natural to think that if O includes everywhere in space at some instant in time, then O would be impermeable. But that turns out not to be true. In a discrete directed set, the idea of everywhere in space at some instant in time is represented by maximal antichain. We draw such an antichain in the right-hand diagram. It consists of red nodes. We can check that it's an antichain because there is no chain between any pair of its elements. We can also check that it's maximal, meaning that we can't add any other elements to it and still get an antichain. But we can see that it's highly permeable. There are lots of chains that go straight through it from past to future without intersecting it. In order to solve the problem of permeability and define ideal observers, we resort to a mathematical construction that is also important in discrete causal theory for a variety of other reasons. This is the construction of relation space over directed set. The relation space is a new directed set which we denote by script R of D. To construct relation space, we first define element of script R for every relation in D. Next, we define relation between two elements in script R whenever the corresponding relation in D itself fits together to form chain of length 2, called 2-chain. Another way to say this is that consecutive relations in D induces higher level relation in script R. In the left-hand diagram, we show that how individual elements and relations in script R are constructed. In right-hand diagram, we show the overall result of the construction. The relation space preserves all the information in the original discrete spacetime except for some boundary information at the beginning and end of time, which is not important for our present interests. An equivalent construction has been used in graph theory for some time. In context, D is called directed graph or digraph for short, and script R is called line digraph of D. For our present purposes, the main reason for carrying out this construction is that permeability problem magically disappears when we move to relation space. More precisely, maximal antichains in relation space are impermeable. Therefore, if we want to construct an ideal observer, we simply have to ensure that the observer contains a maximal antichain in the future of the observed system from the perspective of relation space. Mathematically, this involves a wholesale conversion of a variety of object and subobject from ordinary space-time viewpoint to relation space viewpoint. The fact that this works the way it should is established by a theorem which states that relation space construction defines a functor from a category of directed sets to itself. In fact, we can extend the source of this functor to a category of multi-directed sets which are like directed sets except for they contain multiple relations between a given pair of elements. This extension becomes important in discrete quantum causal theory, but we do not need to discuss the detail here. Basically, for the object R and each of the subobject S, future of S and O, we have corresponding relation space object script R of D, script R of S, script R of future of S, and script R of O. And we can translate statement about original object into statement about relationship object and vice versa. While we are on this topic, we mentioned that there is an interesting relationship between relation space and some of the spaces that arise in Penrose twistor theory. Partly for this reason, the relation space construction is interesting in quantum setting as well as discrete setting.